Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel far back across the centuries into the ancient world of India, a land of great river valleys, planned cities of brick, wandering traders, quiet scholars, and some of the earliest wonders of human civilization. Tonight, you will hear 100 gentle facts about ancient India, drifting softly one into the next, like the slow brown waters of a great river moving toward the sea. There is no need to follow closely. There is no need to remember anything at all. Simply let the old cities rise and fade around you. The brick streets, the busy harbors, the cool stone bathhouses, the lamplit courtyards, while your own thoughts grow slow and your body sinks toward rest. The world we will visit tonight is thousands of years old, its people long gone, its cities mostly returned to the earth, and yet much of what they made still quietly shapes the world we live in now. Let us begin in the deep past, beside a great river, where one of the earliest civilizations on earth once flourished, along the valley of the Indus River and its neighbors, more than 4,000 years ago. There arose a remarkable culture that we now call the Indus Valley civilization. It was one of the three great early civilizations of the ancient world, rising at about the same time as ancient Egypt and the cities of Mesopotamia. And in some ways, it was the largest and most advanced of them all. This ancient civilization covered an enormous area, far larger than Egypt or Mesopotamia, spreading across much of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Hundreds of its settlements have been found, scattered across the plains and river valleys, from small villages to great cities. And yet, for thousands of years, the world entirely forgot that it had ever existed, until its ruins were uncovered again only about a century ago, bringing a whole lost civilization back into the light. The two greatest cities of this civilization were called Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and they were unlike almost anything else in the ancient world. They were not the tangled, winding towns of most early peoples, but carefully planned cities, laid out on a neat grid of straight streets crossing at right angles, much like a modern city. Someone thousands of years ago, had sat down and planned these cities before they were built, dividing them into orderly blocks and broad avenues. The houses of these cities were built of fired brick, baked hard in kilns, and the bricks were made to a standard size, the same proportions used across the whole civilization, in city after city, mile after mile. This is one of the great, quiet wonders of the Indus people, their love of order and standardization, their shared measures carried across enormous distances, as though the whole civilization had agreed upon a single careful way of building. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about these ancient cities was their plumbing. The Indus cities had covered drains running along the streets, carrying away wastewater, and many homes had their own bathing areas, and even toilets connected to this network of drains. They built sophisticated systems for clean water and for carrying away the dirty. Thousands of years ago, a level of public sanitation that much of the world would not see again for many, many centuries. At the heart of Mohenjo-daro stood a remarkable structure that we call the Great Bath, a large rectangular pool of finely fitted brick, made watertight with a lining of natural tar, with steps leading down into it at either end. We do not know exactly what it was for, though many think it was used for some kind of ritual bathing or public gathering. It is the earliest known large public water tank in the world, sitting quietly at the center of the ancient city. Many of the Indus houses were built around a central courtyard, open to the sky, where the family could cook, work, and rest in the open air while remaining within their own walls. The houses often had more than one story, with stairs leading up, and small windows set high in the walls to let in light and air while keeping out the heat and the dust of the street. It was a sensible, comfortable way of living, shaped by the warm climate of the land. The Indus people dug wells throughout their cities, lined neatly with brick, so that fresh water was never far away. In some cities, there were hundreds of these wells, a great many of them, so that nearly every neighborhood had its own source of clean water close at hand. To walk through one of these ancient cities would have been to pass well after well, each a cool round shaft of water sunk into the earth, drawn up in jars by the people of the household. The Indus cities held great granaries, large buildings thought to have been used for storing grain, with clever arrangements for keeping the air flowing through to keep the grain dry. The gathering and storing of surplus grain was one of the foundations of these cities, allowing them to feed large populations and to weather the lean seasons. The careful management of food, stored against times of need, lay quietly beneath the whole achievement of the civilization. The people of the Indus were great traders, and their reach extended far beyond their own land. Their goods have been found in the cities of distant Mesopotamia, carried there across the sea and over the land, and the people of Mesopotamia wrote of a far-off trading land that may well have been the Indus, which they called by a name we read as Meluha. Beads, gemstones, and other fine goods travelled enormous distances from the Indus workshops into the wider ancient world. At a site called Lothal, near the sea, the Indus people built what many believe to be one of the earliest known docks in the world, a great brick basin where boats could be moored and loaded, connected to the river and the sea. From such harbours, ships set out laden with the goods of the Indus and returned with the goods of distant lands. The Indus people were not isolated in their river valley, but were part of a wide and busy web of ancient trade. Among the most beautiful things the Indus people made were their seals, small, flat pieces of carved stone, usually showing an animal and a line of mysterious writing. These seals were pressed into soft clay to make a mark, perhaps to show ownership of goods, much as we might use a stamp or a signature. Thousands of them have been found, carved with great skill, showing bulls, elephants, tigers, and a strange one-horned creature that scholars still puzzle over. The writing upon these seals is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. The Indus people had a script, a system of small symbols, which they carved onto their seals and other objects. But no one today can read it. Despite many efforts over many years, the Indus script has never been deciphered, and so the voices of these people remain silent. To us, their words preserved but unreadable, a quiet riddle waiting still upon the little carved seals. Among the most famous treasures of the Indus civilization is a tiny bronze statue, only about 10 centimeters tall, that we call the Dancing Girl, cast in metal more than 4,000 years ago. She stands in a relaxed and confident pose, one hand on her hip, adorned with bangles upon her arm. She is a small masterpiece of ancient art, and her easy, lifelike posture seems to reach across the thousands of years, a single human figure caught in a moment of grace. The Indus people were skilled in working metal, casting bronze by a clever method in which a model was made of wax, covered in clay, and then heated, so the wax ran out, leaving a mold to be filled with molten metal. With this technique, they made tools, vessels, ornaments, and small statues like the dancing girl. They worked also in copper, in gold, in silver, and in fine stone, and their craftsmanship was patient and precise. The Indus people were among the first in the world to grow and weave cotton, spinning the soft white fibers into thread and weaving them into cloth. For most of history, much of the world's finest cotton would come from India, and it all began here, in these ancient river valleys, where people first learned to turn the fluffy bolls of the cotton plant into cool, soft, comfortable cloth. A fragment of this ancient cotton, thousands of years old, has even survived to be found by modern hands. These ancient people loved small things and playful things, and among their ruins have been found many toys and games. There are little carts with wheels that turn, small animals, some with heads that nod, whistles shaped like birds, and dice much like the dice we still use today. The children of the Indus cities played with these little clay and stone toys in the dust of the courtyards 4,000 years ago, and their toys have outlasted everything else they knew. The Indus people had a remarkable system of weights and measures, standardized across their whole civilization. They made small, precise cubes of stone to use as weights, and these weights followed a careful, regular system, the same in city after city. A merchant in one Indus city would use the very same weights as a merchant hundreds of miles away. This shared and careful measuring speaks of a people who valued fairness, order, and honest trade. The roots of this great civilization reached back even further to an ancient farming village called Mehrgarh, which lies among the very oldest farming settlements in the whole of South Asia, where people grew grain and herded animals thousands of years before the great cities rose. And from this early village comes a truly astonishing discovery. For the teeth of some of its people show tiny, careful holes drilled long ago to treat decay. This is among the earliest known evidence of dentistry anywhere in the world, the work of a skilled hand many thousands of years ago. The great Indus cities were often divided into two parts: a higher walled area, sometimes called the citadel, raised up on a platform of brick, and a lower town spread out below it, where most of the people lived. The higher part held the largest public buildings, such as the Great Bath and the granaries, while the lower town held the houses and the workshops and the markets. This thoughtful division of the city, the public heart raised above the busy streets, was repeated from city to city. The Indus people were wonderfully skilled at making beads, especially long, slender beads of a red stone called carnelian, which they drilled through the center with tiny stone drills. A slow and patient labor. Some of these beautiful beads were so finely made and so prized that they were carried as far as the cities of Mesopotamia, where they were treasured as luxuries. The making of a single long carnelian bead could take many days of careful work, grinding and drilling the hard, bright stone. At a city in the dry lands to the south, called Dholavira, the Indus people built a remarkable system of reservoirs and channels to capture and store every drop of the scarce rain and the water of seasonal streams. Great stone tanks, cut and lined with care, held the precious water through the dry months, allowing a city to thrive in a harsh land. It is one of the earliest and most sophisticated systems of water harvesting known anywhere in the ancient world. One of the most curious things about the Indus civilization is how peaceful and orderly it seems to have been. Archaeologists have found very few weapons, very little sign of warfare, and no great palaces or royal tombs or giant statues of kings. Unlike Egypt with its pharaohs, or Mesopotamia with its warring kings, the Indus people left behind no obvious rulers at all. Their cities seem to have been remarkably equal, well ordered and quiet, a civilization without the grand monuments of power. After many centuries of flourishing, the Indus civilization slowly faded away for reasons we still do not fully understand. It seems that the climate gradually changed, that rivers shifted their courses or dried up, and that the great cities were slowly abandoned as the people moved away to new lands. mostly toward the east. There was no sudden catastrophe, no great destruction, only a long, quiet decline as the cities emptied and the bricks returned, little by little, to the dust. The people did not vanish, of course. They simply moved and changed, and the long story of Indian civilization continued, flowing eastward toward the valley of another great river, the Ganges. Over the centuries that followed, new ways of life developed across the plains of northern India. New villages and towns arose, and iron came into use, allowing the dense forests to be cleared and the rich land to be farmed. The center of Indian life shifted slowly toward the east. In time, across northern India, there arose a patchwork of kingdoms and republics, 16 great realms that the old texts remember, each with its own ruler, its own capital, its own armies and customs. Some were ruled by kings, but others, remarkably, were governed not by a single ruler, but by assemblies of many leaders, a kind of early republic, where decisions were made by gathering and discussion rather than by the will of one. These were among the earliest experiments in shared government anywhere in the world. Out of these many kingdoms grew great cities once again, this time along the Ganges and its tributaries. There was Varanasi beside the sacred river, which is among the oldest cities in the world that people have lived in without pause, inhabited continuously for thousands of years down to the present day. There was Pataliputra, which would become one of the greatest cities on earth, and many others, busy with markets, craftsmen, scholars, and traders. Far to the northwest stood the city of Taxila, which became one of the great centers of learning in the ancient world. Students came to Taxila from across India and beyond to study with its teachers, learning medicine, law, warfare, astronomy, music, and many other arts. It was a kind of ancient university town, perhaps the oldest in the region, where young people gathered around famous teachers to learn the knowledge of their age. Long before universities as we know them existed, it was into this world that, for a brief moment, the armies of a famous conqueror came. From the far west, the Greek king Alexander the Great, having marched across the whole of the known world, reached the edge of India crossing the Indus River. There, at a river in the northwest, he met an Indian king the Greeks called Porus, who fought with a great army that included war elephants, creatures the Greek soldiers found strange and terrible. After this, Alexander's weary men refused to go further, and he turned back toward the west. The coming of Alexander left India largely unchanged, but it opened a window between the Greek world and the Indian one. And afterward, there was more contact, more trade, and more exchange of ideas between them. And it was just after this, as Alexander's brief shadow passed, that one of the greatest empires of the ancient world rose in India, founded by a remarkable man named Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta Maurya, beginning from modest origins, built an empire that came to cover almost the entire Indian subcontinent, the first time so much of India had been united under a single rule. His empire was called the Mauryan Empire, and its capital was the great city of Pataliputra on the banks of the Ganges. From this city, the Mauryan emperors ruled over millions of people across an enormous realm in the centuries before the rise of the Roman Empire. In the West, Chandragupta was guided by a brilliant and famously shrewd advisor, a scholar named Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, who is remembered as the author of a remarkable book called the Arthashastra. This was a detailed treatise on how to run a kingdom, covering government, law, economics, farming, trade, war, and the gathering of information. It is one of the most famous works of statecraft from the entire ancient world, a clear-eyed and practical guide to the holding and using of power. The capital city of Pataliputra was, in its day, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the entire world. A Greek ambassador named Megasthenes came to live there and wrote a description of it, telling of a great city stretching for miles along the river, surrounded by a massive wooden wall with hundreds of towers and many gates and a deep moat. Within were grand palaces, gardens, and broad streets filled with the bustle of one of the busiest cities on earth. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes wrote down many details of the India he saw, describing the people as he understood them, divided into several great classes: the farmers, the herdsmen, the craftsmen, the soldiers, the officials, the counselors, and the wise men or philosophers. He marveled at the orderly running of the great city, at its officials who watched over trade and travellers, and the keeping of records, and at the careful management of so vast a realm. His account, though seen through foreign eyes, is one of our earliest outside glimpses of Indian life. The Mauryan state was elaborately organized, with a great standing army, a complex administration of officials, and even a network of informers and messengers who kept the rulers aware of what passed in the distant corners of the empire. Taxes were gathered, roads and irrigation were maintained, and the affairs of the realm were carefully recorded. It was one of the most sophisticated systems of government anywhere in the ancient world, holding together an empire of many peoples and many lands. In the time of the Mauryas, the finest pottery was a lustrous black ware, polished until it gleamed almost like metal or glass, so fine that it was a luxury good in its own right, traded across the empire. The craftsmen who made it had mastered their kilns and their glazes to a remarkable degree, and a vessel of this shining black pottery. Upon the table was a quiet sign of wealth and refinement in the cities of the age. The Mauryan Empire was held together by a network of roads along which travelled merchants, messengers, soldiers, and officials. One great highway ran for well over 1,000 miles across the north of India, connecting the empire from end to end. A road so useful that it was kept up and travelled for more than 2,000 years afterward, in one form or another. Along these roads were planted shade trees, dug wells, and built rest houses, so that travellers might journey more easily. The greatest of all the Mauryan emperors was Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta, who is remembered as one of the most remarkable rulers in all of history. In his early reign, Ashoka fought a terrible war to conquer a region called Kalinga, and the suffering it caused is said to have filled him with such deep sorrow and regret that he turned away from violence altogether and resolved to rule instead by kindness, justice, and moral teaching. After this great change of heart, Ashoka devoted himself to the welfare of his people in a way almost unheard of among ancient kings. He had wells dug and rest houses built along the roads, planted trees for shade, and established what may have been among the earliest hospitals. providing care not only for people, but, it is said, even for animals. He urged his people toward honesty, kindness, respect for elders, and gentleness toward all living things. Ashoka had his messages carved into great rocks and tall stone pillars set up across his empire, so that all might know his thoughts and his laws. These inscriptions, called the Edicts of Ashoka, still survive today, scattered across the land, and they are among the oldest writings from ancient India that we can actually read through them across more than 2,000 years. We can still hear the very words of an ancient emperor speaking of his hopes for a gentler world. The tall stone pillars that Ashoka raised were beautifully made, polished until they shone, and topped with carved capitals showing animals. The most famous of these shows, 4 lions standing back, to back, carved from a single block of stone, magnificent and serene. This lion capital has become so beloved that, in modern times, it was chosen as the national emblem of India, so that an image carved more than 2,000 years ago appears today on the documents and coins of a great modern nation. Beneath the 4 lions of that famous capital is carved a wheel called the Wheel of Law. And this ancient wheel, too, was honored in modern times, placed at the very center of the flag of India, turning quietly upon its white band. And so, 2 emblems from the age of Ashoka, the lions and the wheel, were carried forward across more than 2,000 years to become the proud symbols of a modern nation. The past and the present joined upon a single banner. Ashoka did more than carve his words in stone. He sent messengers and teachers out beyond his borders to distant lands across Asia and to the island of Sri Lanka to the south, carrying with them the gentle teachings he had embraced. In this way, ideas born in ancient India began to spread far across the world, traveling the trade roads and the sea lanes into many distant countries. One of the great, quiet movements of thought in human history. After the Mauryan Empire eventually faded, India passed through many centuries of smaller kingdoms, of new peoples arriving from the northwest, and of flourishing trade and culture. Then, several centuries later, another great empire arose in northern India, the empire of the Gupta dynasty, and the age of the Guptas is often remembered as a golden age, a time of extraordinary achievement in art, learning, and science. Under the Guptas and in the centuries around their rule, India became one of the great centers of knowledge in the world, and some of the discoveries made there have shaped human thought ever since. Perhaps the greatest of all was in the field of numbers, for it was in ancient India that the system of numerals we use today and the very idea of zero took their mature form. These ideas would travel out from India and, in time, transform mathematics across the whole world. The number system that ancient India gave the world is the one we still use every day, in which the value of a digit depends on its place, so that the same symbol means one thing in the ones column and another in the tens column. This place value system, combined with a small set of simple symbols, made calculation vastly easier than the clumsy older systems, such as the Roman numerals. These Indian numerals travelled west to the Arab world, and from there to Europe, which is why we now call them, a little unfairly, the Arabic numerals. And at the heart of this system lay one of the most powerful ideas in the history of human thought, the idea of zero, a symbol and a number for nothing at all, the idea that nothing itself could be written down, given a sign, and used in calculation like any other number, was a profound leap. Ancient Indian mathematicians came to treat zero not merely as an empty space, but as a number in its own right, with its own rules, and this quiet idea became one of the foundations of all modern mathematics. A great mathematician named Brahmagupta, who lived around 1400 years ago, was among the first anywhere to write down clear rules for working with zero and with negative numbers, treating them as proper numbers to be added and subtracted and multiplied. What he set down in his careful Sanskrit verses became part of the foundation of arithmetic, the everyday mathematics that school children around the world still learn today, though few know its ancient Indian roots. An earlier mathematician and astronomer named Aryabhata, who lived around 1500 years ago, made discoveries that were astonishingly ahead of his time. He understood and used the decimal place value system, calculated the value of pi with remarkable accuracy and worked out the length of the year too, within a few minutes of the true figure. He even proposed, long before most of the world, that the earth itself turns upon its axis, and that this turning is what makes the heavens appear, to wheel across the sky each day. The astronomers of ancient India understood, too, the true cause of eclipses, knowing that the darkening of the moon came from the shadow of the earth falling upon it, and the darkening of the sun from the moon passing before it, rather than from any creature devouring them, as many ancient peoples believed. To explain the eclipses by shadow and geometry so long ago was a remarkable feat of clear and careful thinking about the workings of the heavens. A later scholar named Varahamihira gathered much of the knowledge of his age into a great encyclopedia of astronomy and natural law, ranging across the stars, the seasons, the clouds, the working of gemstones, and 100 other subjects. Such scholars were not only stargazers, but keepers and gatherers of knowledge of every kind, weaving together what was known of the heavens and the earth into vast and careful works. The geometry of ancient India reached back to very old texts that gave careful instructions for laying out altars and structures with precise measurements, and within them lies an understanding of the relationship between the sides of a right-angled triangle, the same rule we now name after the Greek Pythagoras, set down in India in its own form long ago. From the practical need to measure and build came a deep and abstract knowledge of shape and number. There was even, in ancient India, an early glimpse of something we now think of as very modern for a scholar named Pingala, studying that the patterns of long and short syllables in poetry worked with a system of two symbols that has much in common with the binary numbers that lie at the heart of every computer today. In the careful study of the rhythms of Sanskrit verse, ancient Indian thinkers stumbled upon ideas of counting and pattern far ahead of their time. The mathematics of ancient India reached into the study of triangles and angles as well, into what we now call trigonometry. Indian scholars worked out tables of the relationships between the sides and angles of triangles, ideas essential to astronomy and navigation. One of these mathematical terms, passing through Arabic and Latin, on its long journey westward, became our modern word, sign, so that a word used in mathematics classes today carries within it a faint echo of an ancient Sanskrit term. Ancient India was also a great center of medicine, with a healing tradition that took careful note of the body, of diet, of herbs, and of the balance of health. Physicians studied and classified diseases, prepared medicines from countless plants and minerals, and wrote great medical texts that were studied for centuries. Their approach was thoughtful and systematic, seeking to understand the whole person and to restore the body's natural balance through careful living as much as through medicine. One of the most remarkable figures of ancient Indian medicine was a surgeon named Sushruta, whose name is attached to a famous medical text describing an astonishing range of surgical knowledge. The text describes more than 100 surgical instruments and a great many operations, including the setting of bones, the removal of stones, and the treatment of wounds. Most remarkable of all, it describes a method of reshaping a damaged nose by taking a flap of skin from the cheek or forehead, an early form of what we now call plastic surgery. This ancient surgical tradition described operations on the eye to treat the clouding of the lens that blinds the old, and ways of stitching wounds, and careful instructions for cleanliness and preparation before surgery. That such detailed surgical knowledge existed so long ago is a wonder, and these ancient Indian medical texts were later translated and studied across the wider world, carrying their knowledge far beyond the land where they were written. Alongside Sushruta, there was another great physician, Charaka, whose name is attached to a foundational text on the inner workings of the body and the treatment of disease, the medicine of the whole person rather than the surgeon's knife. The healing tradition these texts belong to is called Ayurveda, a name that means beautifully the knowledge of life, and it sought above all to keep a person in balance and in health through diet, through the seasons, through herbs, and through a calm and ordered way of living. This ancient medicine understood health as a balance of forces within the body, and illness as the disturbing of that balance, to be set right by gentle and careful means. Great attention was paid to what one ate, to the rhythm of the day and the year, to rest, and to cleanliness. For the physicians of ancient India believed that preventing illness through a healthy life was far better than curing it once it came. It was a wise and gentle philosophy of well-being, much of which still feels true today. There is even some evidence that the people of ancient India practiced an early form of protection against the dreaded disease of smallpox, deliberately exposing people in a careful way to a mild form of it so that they might be spared the worst. A distant and early ancestor of the vaccination that would one day rid the world of that disease entirely. The careful observation of illness across long centuries had taught them something of how the body could be made ready to resist it. Ancient India was a land of great learning in language and literature as well. Long ago, a brilliant scholar named Panini composed an extraordinarily precise and detailed description of the Sanskrit language, a complete set of rules for its grammar, so thorough and so logical that scholars still marvel at it today. His work was almost like a kind of mathematics of language, breaking speech down into its smallest parts and showing exactly how they fit together, an achievement far ahead of its time. The Sanskrit language itself was the great language of learning, literature, and ritual in ancient India, rich and precise and beautiful, capable of fine shades of meaning. In it were composed vast epics, delicate poems, learned treatises, and plays. Sanskrit is one of the oldest languages still known and studied, and it is a distant relative of many of the languages of Europe, sharing an ancient common ancestor with Greek, Latin, and the tongues that grew from them. The golden age of the Guptas produced a great poet and playwright named Kalidasa, often considered the finest writer in the history of the Sanskrit language. He wrote graceful, tender plays and long lyrical poems, full of love and longing and the beauty of nature, of the changing seasons, the monsoon clouds, and the moods of the human heart. His most famous play tells of a king who falls in love with a maiden of the forest, and it has been loved and performed for some 1500 years. Ancient India was the home of great storytelling, and among its most beloved works was a collection of animal fables in which clever and foolish beasts act out little tales that carry a gentle lesson about life and wisdom. These fables were so loved that they traveled out of India across the centuries, translated from language to language, until versions of these very stories were being told in Persia, in Arabia, and across Europe, mingling with the fables of other lands. Many a tale told to children far from India had its first beginnings in these ancient Indian stories of talking animals. India also produced some of the longest and grandest epic poems ever composed. Vast tales of heroes and kingdoms, woven through with countless smaller stories, songs, and reflections. One of these great epics is among the very longest poems known anywhere in the world, many times the length of the famous epics of ancient Greece. These enormous works were recited and sung across the generations, treasured as both great literature and the shared inheritance of a whole civilization. Their tales known and loved by people in every village of the land. Ancient India gave the world another gift that countless people still enjoy every day, for it was here that the game of chess was born. The early form of chess, called chaturanga, was played on a board of 64 squares, with pieces representing the 4 parts of an ancient Indian army: the foot soldiers, the cavalry, the elephants, and the chariots. From India, this game spread to Persia, then to the Arab world, and at last to Europe, slowly changing along the way into the chess we know. Another ancient Indian game was played. Upon a cross-shaped cloth board, the pieces moved according to the throw of cowrie shells or long dice. A game of journeying around the board toward the center. It was a beloved pastime across India for many centuries, played by people of every kind, and in time it too traveled far and was taken up in distant lands, where it became the ancestor of board games still played in nurseries today. The simple pleasure of moving pieces around a board by the luck of the throw is a very old and very human one. The domesticated chicken, that most common of all the world's farmyard birds, very likely began its long history in Ur, near ancient India and Southeast Asia, descended from the wild jungle fowl of the region. From these lands, the tame fowl spread slowly across the whole world, until today it is found in nearly every country on earth. The humble chicken in farmyards everywhere carries, in a sense, a distant memory of the jungles of ancient India, where its wild ancestors once roamed. Another beloved game came from ancient India as well, the game we now call snakes and ladders, which began as a game with a gentle moral lesson. The ladders represented virtues that lifted a player upward, and the snakes represented faults that brought a player down, so that the simple roll of the dice and the climb toward the finish became a quiet teaching about the journey of a life. From India, it too travelled around the world, into the nurseries of distant lands. Ancient India was, above all, a land of trade, sitting at the crossroads of the ancient world between the East and the West. For thousands of years, goods flowed out of India to distant lands, and merchants grew wealthy carrying them. The most precious of all these goods were the spices, above all pepper, which grew along the southern coasts and was so valued in distant Rome that it was sometimes called black gold, worth its weight in silver in the markets of the West. The spice trade between India and the Roman world was so great that, in time, the wealth of Rome flowed steadily eastward into India to pay for it. And a Roman writer once complained that India was draining the empire of its gold. Roman coins by the thousands have been found in southern India. Payment for the pepper, the spices, the fine cloth, the gems, and the other treasures that Roman ships and traders carried home across the sea. The traders of the ancient world had learned to use the great winds called the monsoon, which blow steadily in one direction for part of the year and then reverse. By sailing out with one season's wind and returning with the next, ships could cross the open ocean between India and the lands to the west, rather than creeping slowly along the coast. This knowledge of the monsoon winds opened the sea roads and bound India ever more closely to the wider world of ancient trade. In the far south of India, beyond the reach of the northern empires, there flourished a distinct and ancient world of its own, with its own languages, its own kings, and its own rich culture. 3 great kingdoms shared the south, and from this region comes some of the oldest poetry in the Tamil language, gathered in collections from an age the Tamils remember as the time of the great academies. These poems of love and of war of the land and the sea are among the treasures of ancient Indian literature, tender and vivid across the centuries. It was the southern coasts, above all, that traded most richly with the distant Roman world. At a port the Romans knew well, on the southwestern coast, ships gathered from across the sea to load pepper and spices, gems and pearls and fine cloth in exchange for Roman gold. Far to the southeast, near another coast, the remains of an ancient trading settlement have been found, where Roman goods were unloaded. A meeting place of two distant worlds, where merchants from the Mediterranean dealt with the traders of India. A Greek-speaking merchant once wrote a careful guide to the ports and goods of these eastern seas, a kind of handbook for traders, listing the harbours of India and what could be bought and sold at each. From it we learn of the busy commerce of the Indian coasts, of the spices and textiles and ivory and gems that flowed outward, and of the gold and wine and fine goods that came in. It is a vivid window into the bustling sea trade of the ancient world, written by one who sailed those waters himself. Among the treasures that India sent out into the world were pearls from its southern waters, ivory from its elephants, fragrant sandalwood, brilliant gemstones, and even, it is said, peacocks and other exotic creatures carried away to delight the courts of distant kings. The very name of India became, in far-off lands, a byword for richness and wonder, a source of precious and beautiful things from beyond the edge of the known world. Among the most famous of India's goods were its textiles, its cottons and fine cloths, which were prized across the ancient world for their softness, their bright colours, and their beautiful patterns. Indian weavers produced cloth of astonishing fineness, including muslins so light and sheer that they were spoken of with wonder, as though they were woven air or running water. For many centuries, India clothed much of the world in its cotton, and its weavers were among the finest anywhere. The making of cotton cloth in ancient India was a long chain of patient skill, from the picking of the cotton to the cleaning and combing of the fibres, to the spinning of thread upon a simple spindle or wheel, to the weaving of the cloth upon a loom. Whole villages might be devoted to one part or another of this work, the spinners and the weavers and the dyers, each masters of their craft, the soft white thread drawn out and twisted between the fingers was the beginning of cloth that would travel to the ends of the earth. Indian craftsmen also mastered the art of printing patterns upon cloth, carving designs into blocks of wood, dipping them in dye, and pressing them onto the fabric again and again to build up beautiful repeating patterns of flowers and figures and shapes. Cloth printed and dyed in this way, in bright and fast colours that did not easily wash out, was among the wonders of Indian craft. And in later ages, it would be sought after across the whole world for its beauty. Ancient India was also the source of the deep blue dye called indigo, made from a plant, which gives a rich and lasting blue colour to cloth. So closely was this dye tied to India that its very name, indigo, comes from a word meaning Indian, the blue thing that came from India. For thousands of years, India supplied the world with this precious blue, and the deep colour of indigo-dyed cloth was treasured. In distant lands, far from where the plant grew, India gave the world something sweet as well, for it was here that people first learned to grow sugar cane and to boil down its juice into crystals of sugar. The very word sugar comes through many languages from an ancient Indian word. Before this, much of the world sweetened its food only with honey. The making of solid, storable sugar from the tall, sweet cane was an Indian invention, and travellers from far away marvelled at the reed that produced honey without any bees. For all its trade and its science, ancient India was a land where most people lived simple lives in countless villages, farming the land and following the slow rhythm of the seasons. The village was the heart of Indian life, a close community of farmers, craftsmen, and their families, often governed by a council of elders who settled disputes and managed the shared affairs of the community. These village councils were a quiet and lasting feature of Indian life, enduring through the rise and fall of empires above them. At the heart of many a village stood a great, spreading tree, often a banyan or a peepal, in whose deep shade the people would gather in the heat of the day to rest, to talk, to trade, and to settle the affairs of the community. These ancient trees, some of them growing for centuries, until their hanging roots formed whole groves, were beloved gathering places, cool and green, the natural meeting hall of village life. Beneath such a tree, generation after generation passed the slow afternoons of the countryside. The rhythm of the village day was set by the sun beginning before dawn with the grinding of grain and the milking of the cattle, moving through the long labour in the fields and closing in the evening as the lamps were lit and the families gathered for their meal. Small oil lamps, little clay dishes holding oil and a wick, lit the homes of ancient India as darkness fell, their soft flames flickering in the doorways and the courtyards. And on festival nights, countless such lamps would be set out together until whole towns glowed gently in the dark. The food of ancient India was built upon grains. Above all, rice in the wetter regions and wheat, and barley in the drier north, along with many kinds of lentils and beans, which together made a nourishing and balanced diet. To these were added vegetables, fruits, milk and its many products, and, above all, a wealth of spices. The cooking of ancient India was rich with flavour, using turmeric, ginger, cumin, pepper, and many other spices to make even simple food fragrant and delicious. The golden spice turmeric coloured the food and was prized, as well for its use in healing and in ceremony, and the warm spices of cardamom, cinnamon, clove, and pepper filled the kitchen with their fragrance. The art of blending many spices together, each balanced against the others, was very old in India, and from it grew one of the great cooking traditions of the world, in which a simple bowl of rice and lentils could be made rich and warming, with a handful of fragrant spices. Many people in ancient India followed a vegetarian way of eating, avoiding meat out of a deep respect for living things, an idea that ran through much of Indian culture, the principle of not harming living creatures, of gentleness toward all that lives, was honoured by many, and it shaped the food upon the table as much as the conduct of daily life. India developed, as a result, one of the world's great traditions of vegetarian cooking, varied and flavourful and ancient. Many of the foods that grew in ancient India have since spread across the whole world and become familiar everywhere. The eggplant, or aubergine, with its glossy purple skin, is native to India, and so are certain cucumbers and several kinds of beans and gourds. The cooking pot of the ancient Indian household drew upon a rich variety of vegetables and pulses, grains and fruits, milk curdled into soft cheeses and churned into butter, all brought to life with the fragrant spices for which the land was famous. The society of ancient India was ordered into broad groupings, set apart by their work and their place in the community. The priests and teachers, the rulers and warriors, the farmers and merchants, and those who labored and served. Within these broad divisions were countless smaller communities, often tied to a particular craft or calling, into which a person was usually born. This ordering of society was a deep and lasting feature of ancient Indian life, shaping the work a person did and the community to which they belonged. The people of ancient India loved sweet scents and made much use of perfumes, fragrant oils, and incense, drawn from flowers, from spices, and above all, from the fragrant heartwood of the sandalwood tree, whose sweet, lingering scent was prized across the ancient world. Incense was burned to perfume the home and to honor the sacred, and fragrant oils were rubbed upon the skin. The air of an ancient Indian household on a festival day would have been sweet with the smoke of sandalwood and the scent of flowers. The cattle of India, especially the humped cattle called the zebu, were treasured animals, valued for their milk, for pulling carts and ploughs, and for the many useful things they provided. Cattle were so important to life and farming that they came to be deeply respected, and the gentle care of cattle became a lasting part of Indian custom. The patient ox drawing the plough or the cart was one of the most familiar sights of the ancient Indian countryside. The elephant, too, held a special place in ancient India, both as a working animal of great strength and as a creature of war and of royal splendor. Tamed elephants hauled timber and stone, carried kings in grand processions, and marched in the armies of the great empires. To own and command elephants was a sign of power and the knowledge of how to capture, train, and care for these enormous, intelligent animals was a respected art in ancient India. The brilliant peacock with its shimmering tail of blue and green eyes, was beloved in ancient India, admired for its beauty and woven into art and story, and so prized that peacocks were carried away as wonders to distant lands. The bright birds wandered the gardens and courtyards, spreading their great fans of feathers, and their sudden calls were said to herald the coming of the monsoon rains. To this day, the peacock is honored in India, a living jewel of the gardens, as it was in the deep past. The people of ancient India were skilled in working iron and steel, and they produced a kind of steel so fine that it became famous across the world. This Indian steel, made by a special method of melting iron in sealed clay containers, was carried to distant lands, and in the workshops of the Middle East it was forged into the celebrated blades known as Damascus steel, prized for their strength, their sharpness, and the beautiful flowing patterns in the metal. The secret of this fine steel began in southern India, a wonderful proof of the skill of ancient Indian ironworkers still stands today, a tall pillar of iron made more than 1,500 years ago. That has stood out in the open air for all those centuries and has barely rusted at all. How the ancient smiths made iron so pure and so resistant to rust is a marvel that has drawn the wonder of modern scientists, a silent monument to a mastery of metal achieved long ago. The great pillar was raised in the time of the Gupta kings in honor of a mighty ruler of that golden age, and it has stood through all the centuries since, through monsoon rains beyond counting, its surface still smooth and dark, scarcely touched by rust, a quiet challenge to the metalworkers of every age that has followed. The golden age of the Guptas was remembered as a time of peace and plenty, and one of its greatest kings took the proud title of Vikramaditya, the son of valor, a name that became, in later memory, almost a legend attached to tales of a wise and splendid ruler whose court shone with poets and scholars and artists. Whether legend or history, the name came to stand for the very idea of a golden age, a time when learning and art flourished under a just and generous king. India was, for much of history, the world's only source of diamonds, found in the gravels of certain southern rivers, long before they were discovered anywhere else. The famous diamond mines of the south produced many of the most celebrated gems of the ancient and medieval world. Brilliant stones that were carried to the courts of distant kings for a very long time. If one held a diamond anywhere in the world, it had almost certainly come from the rivers of India. The craftsmen of ancient India were masters of many arts beyond metal and cloth. They carved delicate ornaments and figures from ivory, cut and polished precious gems, worked gold and silver into fine jewelry, and shaped clay into pots and figures and toys. Indian ornaments and jewelry were famous for their beauty and their intricate work, and people of all classes adorned themselves with bangles, beads, rings, and earrings, loving colour and ornament as a part of daily life. India was rich in precious and semi-precious stones, beyond its diamonds, in glowing red carnelian and rich blue lapis, in agates and amethysts and pearls, and its lapidaries were masters at cutting, drilling, and polishing them into beads and ornaments. Beads were among the very oldest of Indian crafts, made for thousands of years and traded far and wide, so that a string of bright Indian beads might end its journey in a land its makers had never heard of, an ornament passed from hand to hand across the whole of the ancient world. The most common sight upon the roads of ancient India was surely the bullock cart, two patient oxen drawing a simple wooden cart upon creaking wooden wheels, carrying grain, goods, and people slowly along the dusty tracks. This humble vehicle, little changed across thousands of years, was the workhorse of the land, and models of just such carts have been found among the toys of the Indus cities, 4,000 years old, showing that the patient ox and the wooden cart have rolled along the roads of India since the very dawn of its civilization. Along the great roads moved caravans of traders, sometimes very large, carrying goods between the cities and to the ports, resting at night in rest houses or camped beneath the stars. The roads could be long and the journeys slow, and merchants often travelled together in companies for company and safety, their carts and pack animals strung out along the way. The arrival of such a caravan at a town, laden with goods from distant places, was a welcome event, bringing news and wares from far away. Ancient Indians built great mounded monuments called stupas, large, dome-shaped structures of brick and stone, raised over sacred relics as places of reverence and pilgrimage. One of the most famous, the Great Stupa at Sanchi, was begun in the time of the Emperor Ashoka and stands to this day, a vast solid dome surrounded by beautifully carved stone gateways, covered with scenes of ancient life, carved in loving detail by long ago hands. Among the most breathtaking achievements of ancient Indian art are the great cave temples and monasteries, carved directly into the living rock of cliffs and hillsides. At places like Ajanta and Ellora, generations of craftsmen cut entire halls, pillars, and chambers out of solid stone, and adorned the walls with paintings and sculptures of extraordinary beauty. The paintings of Ajanta, glowing softly in the dim rock chambers, are among the finest surviving paintings of the ancient world. To create these cave temples, the ancient craftsmen worked from the top down, carving away the rock to reveal halls and statues hidden within the cliff, removing thousands of tons of stone by hand. At one great site, an entire temple, complete with towers, courtyards, and carved figures, was cut downward out of a single hillside. A whole building released from the solid rock. It is one of the most astonishing feats of patient labor and artistry anywhere in the world. Ancient India also developed the art of water management to a high degree, building great tanks and reservoirs to store the rains, and beautiful step wells, deep wells reached by long descending staircases lined with carved stone. These step wells went far down into the earth to reach the water table, and their cool depths offered shelter from the heat, as well as water. They were both practical structures and works of art. Their many steps and galleries carved with great care. The scholars of ancient India had a deep love of astronomy, watching the night sky with great care, tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars, and using their observations to make calendars and to mark the proper times for the seasons and the festivals. They built up a detailed knowledge of the heavens, and their astronomical texts, written in elegant Sanskrit verse, carried this knowledge down through the generations. The mathematicians of ancient India delighted in very large numbers, and the Sanskrit language had names for numbers far larger than most ancient peoples ever needed, reaching up into enormous quantities, vast beyond ordinary use. This love of great numbers and the ease of writing them with the place value system and the zero gave Indian thinkers a remarkable freedom in their calculations, allowing them to roam comfortably among quantities that would have baffled other ancient peoples. Let us return now to the great centers of learning, for ancient India built some of the first true universities in the world. The most famous of all was the great monastery and University of Nalanda, founded under the Gupta kings, which grew into an enormous residential university where thousands of students lived and studied together. At its height, it is said to have held many thousands of students and many hundreds of teachers, drawn from across India and from distant lands beyond. Nalanda was a vast complex of halls, courtyards, temples, and dormitories, where students studied not only religion and philosophy, but also medicine, mathematics, astronomy, grammar, and logic. Its library was legendary, said to have filled great buildings, one of them several stories tall, holding a vast collection of manuscripts. Students came to Nalanda from China, from Korea, from across Asia, traveling enormous distances to study at this famous seat of learning. One of these travelers was a Chinese monk named Xuanzang, who journeyed all the way from China to India, a long and difficult road, and spent years studying at Nalanda before returning home, laden with manuscripts. He wrote a detailed account of his travels, describing the lands, the cities, the customs, and the great university he had seen. And his writings are among our most precious windows into the India of that age, the careful record of a curious and devoted traveler, the daily life of a student at such a place was one of quiet discipline and study, of rising early, of debate and discussion, of copying out texts by hand onto leaves and into manuscripts, of learning from revered teachers. Knowledge in ancient India was treasured and carefully preserved, much of it carried in the memory and passed down by word of mouth with great precision, as well as written down, so that the learning of the past was handed faithfully to the future. The great writing system of ancient India was a script called Brahmi, from which a vast family of later scripts descended, branching and changing over the centuries. From this ancient root grew the many scripts in which the languages of India are written to this day, and even some of the scripts of distant lands across Asia. The very letters that Ashoka had carved into his pillars belonged to this old and fertile script, the parent of so many alphabets that followed. Much of the writing of ancient India was done upon the dried leaves of certain palm trees, cut into long, narrow strips, on which letters were carefully scratched or inked. These palm leaf manuscripts were bound together with cord and protected between wooden covers, and in the dry climate they could last a very long time, faithfully copied again and again over the generations. As the older leaves wore out, whole libraries of knowledge were preserved in these humble, fragrant leaves. Long before the great universities, learning in ancient India often took place in a gentle and intimate way in what was called the Gurukula, in which a young student would go to live in the household of a teacher, sometimes for many years, learning not only lessons but a whole way of life. The student would help with the daily tasks of the household and learn through closeness and service, as much as through formal teaching, the knowledge passing slowly and personally from teacher to pupil, almost as within a family. It was in ancient India, too, that there developed the practice of yoga, a discipline of the body and the mind together, of posture, of breath, and of stillness, meant to bring calm, health, and clarity. Over the long centuries, this practice was refined and deepened. Its gentle postures and quiet breathing carried down through the generations. Today, yoga is practiced by countless people all around the world, often without their knowing how very ancient it is, or how far it has travelled from the land where it began. A scholar of ancient India gathered the teachings of yoga into a set of brief and careful sayings that became its great foundational text, describing how the restless mind might be quieted and brought to stillness through patient practice. The aim, in its oldest form, was a calm and steady mind, gathered and at peace, much as one might wish for, drifting towards sleep on a quiet night, the thoughts growing slower and the breath growing soft. The people of ancient India wore garments of cloth, wrapped and draped about the body rather than sewn and fitted, light and graceful and well suited to the warm climate. The long wrapped garment worn by women, draped in many elegant ways, and the simpler wrapped cloth worn by men have been worn in India for thousands of years and are worn still today, a living link of cloth and custom reaching back to the ancient world. The people of ancient India loved ornament and color, adorning themselves with jewelry of gold, silver, and gemstones, with flowers in the hair, and with fragrant oils and perfumes. Both women and men wore ornaments, and the love of bangles upon the wrist, of earrings and necklaces and rings, was very old, reaching all the way back to the dancing girl of the Indus with her stacked bangles 4,000 years before. Beauty and adornment were woven through the texture of daily life. Music and dance were a deep part of ancient Indian culture, with rich traditions of song, of instruments, and of expressive dance that told stories through movement and gesture. The musical traditions of India grew very sophisticated, with elaborate systems of melody and rhythm, and the dance forms combined intricate footwork with the graceful movements of the hands and the expressions of the face. These arts were treasured and refined across the centuries, performed at festivals, in temples, and in the courts of kings. Ancient India observed many festivals through the turning of the year, tied to the seasons, the harvests, and the movements of the sun and moon, times of gathering, feasting, lamps, color, and joy. The festivals brought communities together in shared celebration, breaking the rhythm of ordinary labor with days of brightness and rejoicing. Many of these ancient festivals are still kept today, their roots reaching far back into the deep past of Indian custom. The merchants and craftsmen of ancient India often organized themselves into guilds, associations of those who shared a trade, which set standards, settled disputes, supported their members, and even acted as a kind of bank. These guilds were powerful and respected, and they brought order and trust to the busy world of ancient commerce. A craftsman belonged not only to his family and his village, but to his guild, his fellows in the same patient art. The market street of an ancient Indian city was a place of color and bustle, lined with the open stalls and workshops of the craftsmen and merchants. Each trade often gathered together in its own quarter. There were the sellers of grain and spices, of cloth and garlands, of pots and jewelry and sweets, the smith at his forge, and the potter at his wheel, the money changer with his scales. The air was thick with the scent of spices and flowers and cooking, and loud with the sounds of bargaining and craft. The whole busy life of the city flowing through its narrow lanes. The coins of ancient India tell their own quiet story, from the early punch-marked coins, small pieces of silver stamped with simple symbols, to the beautiful gold coins of the Gupta kings, finely struck with images of rulers and figures. Money made trade easier and bound the economy together, and the coins that survive, worn and tarnished, are small windows into the rulers, the art and the commerce of the ancient world, passed from hand to hand long ago. Ancient India was a land of great rivers, and life everywhere depended upon them. Above all, the Indus in the west and the Ganges in the east, along whose banks the cities rose, and the fields were watered. The rivers were the highways of trade, the source of water for the crops, and the very heart of the land's life. The yearly flooding of the rivers and the coming of the monsoon rains set the rhythm of the farming year, and the whole of life moved with the waters. The monsoon, that great seasonal rain that sweeps across India each year, was the very pulse of the land, longed for through the dry heat and welcomed with joy, when at last the clouds gathered and the rains came pouring down. Upon the monsoon depended the harvests and the prosperity of all. The coming of the rains was celebrated in poetry and song. The dark clouds and the first cool drops, a symbol of relief, of life renewed, of the gentle mercy of the heavens upon the thirsty earth. So we have wandered through the long ages of ancient India, from the brick cities of the Indus, through the great empires of the Mauryas and the Guptas, among scholars and traders and craftsmen and farmers. It was a civilization of remarkable achievement, giving the world the numbers we count with, the zero, the game of chess, fine cotton and steel and sugar, and a deep and ancient tradition of learning, art, and thought, much of which quietly shapes our world even now. And in the end, the greatest wonder of ancient India is perhaps how much of it endured, flowing down through the centuries into the living culture of today, in the wrapped garments still worn, the spices still ground, the festivals still kept, the numbers still counted, the old stories still told. The empires rose and fell, the cities crumbled and were forgotten and found again. And yet the long, slow river of Indian civilization flowed on, carrying the past gently into the present. There is nothing now that you need to do, nothing to follow, nothing to hold. Let the ancient cities fade softly into the dark, the brick streets and the busy harbours, and the lamplit courtyards, while the great rivers flow on quietly through the night, as they have for thousands of years. The lamps of the old city burn low. The looms fall silent. The river moves slowly past the sleeping town, brick and river and starlight. The slow turning of the ancient year, the monsoon clouds drifting far away. Only the river now, flowing softly through the dark toward the distant and patient sea. Quiet, ancient, still.